My name is Heather DuVall. I'm the controller here at the conference office, and I've probably spoken or emailed with most of you in this room. But we are going to talk about local church finance. So we will just get going. So we just wanted to give you, the list of our administrative services team, and that includes David Garvin, who you will meet later today, and he is our Director of Administrative Services and the Treasurer. Then there's myself, and then Leslie Williams, who is our Benefits Administrator, and so if you've had to deal with pension or health insurance for your clergy, you've probably spoken with her. And then Mandy Stewart, who does our accounts receivable for us, so she helps us out with that. I'm also going to get my notes. So just want to give you some resources that you can look to and look at if you're ever in need of help with respect to finance information. One is definitely our website. We do have a finance and administration section on there, which is very helpful and we have a frequently asked questions section and different information on there. Your administrative services team, so the ones I just listed a few minutes ago, we are your resources. So if you ever have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out by phone or email, and we will do our best to help. Each other in this room, you guys, you're going to be your all's best resources. Your small churches and your large churches, medium churches, you guys can reach out to everybody and ask some of those questions to your counterparts in those areas, and they would be a resource to you. Some of the general church resources on the GCFA website. They have a tax packet to help you with local church clergy taxes. They have a legal manual, the local church audit guide, and another important website, which if you guys haven't gone to, is the Group Ruling website. So this is where you can go and put in your information about your local church, and they will give you a letter for the group exemption of the 501c3. And so that is also an important place to look if you don't already have that letter. So the things we're going to kind of go over and talk about today are the roles of the finance committee. So I want to make sure clicking all this the right way. Your team organization and responsibilities. We're going to look at some internal controls, the importance of audits. We're going to review budgets, look at our mission covenant, and of course clergy taxes, because I know that's also an important area for people to know and understand. So finance committee. The responsibilities of your finance committee are your stewardship of your financial resources. That is really important to make sure that your church can cover the expenses that you have and bringing in the tithes and offerings and recording those appropriately. You're responsible for compiling a budget on an annual basis. We're probably starting to get into that budgeting time of the year right now, and so that is an important piece of the finance committee. You want to designate an offering count team. So, 3 or 4 people that are responsible for counting the offerings on Sundays and reporting that information back. You're responsible for establishing written policies, financial policies, and procedures, and having those written down so people know how to, account for all the assets and money that are coming through the church. And also make a provision for an annual audit. That is important on your church to do those audits. And again, we'll get into that more later, but it does not mean a CPA firm audit. So just want to put that out there too. So it doesn't actually mean having a CPA firm do it, because that can get expensive. The different members of finance committees, there are quite a few people listed here, and they all play an important role. Of course, you've got your chairperson, the pastor, the lay member to the annual conference, church council chair, SPRC chair, which Kevin mentioned earlier. They are responsible for recommending the salary to the finance committee, so that's why they're a part of it. A trustees representative, because they're going to know what kind of repairs need to happen in the church, and that's going to be part of this finance responsibility you have. Financial secretary and treasurer. So those are all different people that you want to be part of that finance committee. So next, there's 2 separate roles. There's a financial secretary and a church treasurer. And Per the Book of Discipline, those two roles should be separate and not held by the same person. They do have separate responsibilities, so it's important that they are two separate people. So the financial secretary should supervise that offering count team. So they should be making sure they're doing what they should, filling out the appropriate paperwork on those count sheets, and getting it turned in and that offering taken to the bank. And they're responsible for making records of those contributions as people give them. So that person is responsible for keeping up with the members' contribution records and making sure it's entered appropriately and to the right person, and all the information is captured as they do that. You want to provide contribution statements to your members, at least on a quarterly basis, so that they can see what they have contributed, and then it's really important at the end of the year for their financial records that you give them a year-end statement. But doing it throughout the year can also, it's a good chance for them to review it. And I mean, we all fat finger things, and so, I mean, I've done it. We can, but that review gives them a chance to look at the records that you have recorded and make sure that it agrees with what they think they've given to you. So it's just kind of a checks and balances to make sure that they get those statements. And the financial secretary, they really are more than just a keeper of records. They're going to know kind of the flows of the church and whether or not, winter time is slower time for tithes and offerings. And same with summer. They may know kind of those ebbs and flows of when more offerings are coming in throughout the year versus when they're slower. And so that's just good information to have and be able to present to, your pastor and your finance committee to know, okay, if we've got a, bigger project coming up, this may not be the best time of year to do it, because there may not be as much money coming in. So it's just, they're going to have that information, and it is important to share it with others so that everybody is aware. So the treasurer, their responsibility. So the financial secretary is more about the money coming in. The treasurer is going to be more about the money going out. And so they're going to be responsible for dispersing all the money and then making detailed reports of that to the finance committee. They are going to be the ones that are responsible for making sure that any funds that the church receives with restrictions on it, that those funds are expended appropriately and used for the appropriate restriction. And then they're going to track income and expenses against budget. And they're going to be able to report all that stuff to the finance committee and provide it, and so that they can see, this year, maybe even compared to last year and compared to budget, so that you guys can have a full picture of how things are going within the church. So next we'll look at internal controls. And also, if you guys have questions as I go along, please feel free to ask them. We'll stop and do that if you have any, but we'll just keep rolling, and otherwise we'll just keep going. So internal controls. This is a very important piece because we want to make sure that the money that you receive as a church is being handled appropriately and is doing all the good that it can, and you're being good stewards of the money that people are entrusting to you. We like to think that fraud doesn't happen in churches, but we know that it does, and so the more internal controls you can have in place to help prevent that, the better. So important benefits. It provides accountability. If you know that there are multiple people along the process of getting money dispersed, it just provides that accountability, and it means that one person isn't responsible for everything. And it helps prevent, if there does become a problem or somebody does think something's suspicious and it's all on one person, then it helps prevent that one person from being under scrutiny. If there are multiple steps throughout the process, it just helps that along the way. It promotes financial accuracy in your financial records and promotes confidence in givers. If the givers know that you are handling the money as it should be done, it just it promotes that confidence, and they're more willing to give it if they know those things. And as I mentioned, it does help prevent fraud. Some ways you can help protect your church's resources. There are three kind of basic functions: authorization of transactions, recording them, and then the custody of the assets. If those three things are done by separate people, it just helps with those internal controls and helps make things run a little smoother. So some best practices. Prepare an accounting procedures manual. Kind of list out, like, here's how we do things. Here's who is responsible for approving expenses. Here's once those expenses are approved, here's who the request goes to for the check to be written. Here's who's responsible for recording the income. So just kind of have those things lined out. And I think one of the documents that you gave was just kind of a sample of what could be included in that procedures manual, just to give you an idea of things you could put in there, like what time of year you do your budget, who all's involved in doing that, just so that if something happens and somebody else needs to step into one of these roles, they can go to that book and know, here are things that we know how to do, and aren't just completely left in the dark trying to figure it out. So it's just good to have all those kinds of things documented. Anyone who handles church funds should be bonded or insured. You want to reconcile your bank statements monthly, and I hope everybody in this room is doing that, just so you can verify that the deposits that went into the bank match your records, and that all checks clearing the bank were appropriate and are also recorded in your system, so that that information can be looked at. Detailed monthly reports reviewed by the Finance Committee. So hopefully, even if you're not meeting monthly, hopefully the treasurer is sending out a monthly statement to the Finance Committee members so that they can be aware of how things are going, between those meetings that you have. And then financial reports should be audited annually. That is very important, again, just to make sure things are being handled as they should be. Some specific controls related to receipts. You should always have 2 unrelated people counting the offering. That is the utmost important thing, because it's harder for 2 unrelated people to try to, get together and decide to take the money. And you never want it to just be one person, because if something goes missing, then everybody's going to go back to that one person. So, try the best you can to have 2 unrelated people do it. And another thing is, if you have like 3 or 4 people that are kind of on that count team, you rotate through those people that are counting, so that it's not always the same 2 people. You get different people involved also. Counting should take place at the church office, never at home. I know that seems like it should be kind of intuitive, but we have heard stories where somebody would take the money home and count it and deal with it. So yeah, you're shaking your head. Definitely not. That should always happen at the church office. Use a cash count sheet to kind of document, how much cash comes in, how much checks comes in, so that then that can be totaled and then tied back to the deposit receipt you get from the bank. Okay. Some controls specific to disbursements. The individual who writes the checks should not also be a signer. That's just one way that you can have some controls in place with respect to that. So like at the conference level, I'm the one who prints the checks, but I have no check signing authority. And so I have to go get signatures from somebody else in order to get those checks out the door. You could also consider requiring 2 signers on your checks. This is just another layer of internal control, and it doesn't have to be all checks. It could be checks over a certain dollar amount. So they could be, your larger ones where you would require that second signature. It's just another layer of support through that. You could use an expense voucher to request payment for certain things. And then on that expense voucher, you could put, this is the budget account number it needs to go to, this is the purpose, all that information, so that it just makes it easier on the person recording that information also. Credit card policy. I know credit cards are kind of, a bigger thing. I'm not sure how many in the room has a church credit card, but it would be good to kind of list out a policy of what charges are allowed on the credit card, and, document who's allowed to use it, and just make sure that you get all receipts for all charges every month, so that you can tie them back to that and make sure that they are appropriate charges. Yes?
Question. What is the conference's position on using services from the bank, like bill pay, different signatures or multiple signatures in that situation?
Did you hear the question?
I think he was asking about how do we feel about using bill pay through the bank and how you would reconcile signatures on that information. Well, I think, you would limit that by who has access to the online banking and who has the authority to sign into that online banking account. Would take care of your signatures there. And so you would want to make sure that it's an appropriate person, and then you would want to make sure, like then on reconciling your bank statements, that it's somebody that doesn't have the ability to do those online payments. So that's, again, another control, another layer, so that it's not the same person doing those online bill pays that is reconciling your bank account. Because if they're doing something wrong, you want to be able to see that somebody else could catch it. So I think that's how you could do that. And also, looking at allowable business expenses. What is going to be allowable for, particular reimbursements, either for your clergy or for staff, and how you're going to look at that and deal with those. So, allowable business expense. It would be good to adopt an accountable reimbursement policy for your clergy and for your staff, and that means that they have to then turn in receipts in order to get reimbursed for it, and then it is not taxable to them. And so, but they have to do that within 60 days of when that expense is incurred, and they have to document certain things for IRS rules of who, what, when, where, how, to be considered an accountable reimbursement policy and for it not to be taxable. So, for instance, if you just said, for your clergy that for their travel, you're just going to give them $100 a month, that may be low, I don't know, just throwing out numbers. But if you're just going to give them $100 a month for any travel they do, that's considered taxable because they don't have to provide you any backup for it. But if you tell them, I'm going to reimburse you at the IRS business mileage rate, they then have to document where they went, how many miles it was, all that information. You can reimburse them, and then it's not taxable to them. So that's the importance of that accountable reimbursement policy.
I'm jumping back a little bit.
Okay.
Internal control receipts, use a cash account sheet to document money collected. And on that sheet also, the person's county should document specific, when someone makes an offering for a specific cause, that count sheet should acknowledge that also.
Yes, it should acknowledge if that money that was received is designated for a certain purpose, so that then the person recording it in your financial records can also make that same designation. And on that count sheet, you would want whoever's counting it to be signing that sheet so that you know who the counters were if there is an issue between the count and the receipt from the bank. Okay. So I think we'll move on to audits. They are important. And I know that might seem, they're not fun, except for some people, like me, do enjoy those. But they do create a culture of fiscal responsibility. And again, it is another way that you can assure that gifts are being used for their appropriate purpose. And it just builds trust and confidence in your givers. If they can see that you've got an audit being performed and there's no issues reported in that audit, it just, again, provides that confidence and trust in those givers that you are doing what you said you were going to do with the money. And also, it is a way to protect those that are involved in the counting and the writing of the checks and all of those procedures. It protects them also because it just gives that assurance that they are doing what they should be doing when you get that audit. As I don't know if I mentioned this before, but an annual audit is required by the Book of Discipline. And, it's defined as an independent evaluation of the financial reports and records and the internal controls of the local church by a qualified person or persons. And so it's going to include quite a few different things. And so it's going to include a review of your cash and bank reconciliations. It's going to look at investment records. They're going to want to interview different people throughout the church. So they're going to want to interview the treasurer, the financial secretary, probably the pastor, any other staff, just so they can get an idea of how the flow of our finances works. They're going to probably look at journal entries, and they're going to want to look at who the authorized signers are and to make sure that checks are being signed appropriately by those individuals. And then the finance committee could request any other specific procedures. So if there's something you want somebody to specifically look at, you can request that, and then they will look at it and provide you information about it. Kevin?
You notice, Heather, sometimes the treasurer feels like you don't trust them. So I tell people this protects the treasurer. If you're doing an annual audit, then you have confirmation they're completely innocent of handling money.
Yes.
My question is, and forgive me if you touched this, I didn't hear it. There was a time we recommended that treasurers be bonded at the local church. Is that still the recommendation?
Yes.
Maybe I'm jumping ahead of it.
No, I mentioned that earlier. It is a good idea to have the treasurer bonded and insured, and you can reach out to your insurance company and ask them about that. And they may tell you, yep, you've already got that coverage, or they may tell you, no, we probably couldn't, we can add that. So it's just something you would reach out to your insurance company about. But yes, audits, it's not because we don't trust those that are involved in doing the procedures. It really is as a protection of those involved in doing it, so that somebody, a third party, can look at it and say, yes, you are doing things as you should be doing them. And this is part of what I mentioned earlier, is that not every church will need a CPA firm audit. There is a local church audit guide out on GCFA's website. And in that guide, it is a pretty in-depth guide. It will tell you, based on local church receipts, what they recommend for an audit. And I think they have like maybe three, 4, or 5 different levels of receipts, and it will tell you what kind of audit is recommended. Obviously, the higher your receipts, the more likely you're going to need a local CPA firm to do the audit. So that is definitely a helpful guide. It also does have in the back of it some procedures that can be done for an audit, so that's a good place to go. If you've not had an audit done, you can go to that guide, go to the back of it, look at those lists of procedures, and that can be a guiding point to get you started there. So some of the procedures that would be done is that you would independently verify the reports of the treasurer. You'd follow the money and test it along the way and how it's treated at different steps. Document that any donated and earned funds of the congregation have been used as stipulated by the donors. And then you would want it to be reviewed and accepted by your finance committee. And so sometimes those audits can provide recommendations, and so then the finance committee would want to look at those recommendations and decide, okay, how are we going to take care of this issue? Or sometimes it could be an issue that you're thinking, okay, I think we're good, this hasn't been a problem, we'll keep that in the back of our minds, it may be not something we adjust currently, but you do want to look at all of those and decide, is this something that, gosh, we have to do this, or is this something it'd be nice if we were able to, but maybe not right now, we can't. So you do want to look at all those and discuss it as a committee. There are definitely multiple groups that you would include in your audit, and those have all been listed here. So, trustees, any memorial funds, local church foundation or endowment funds, anybody that has a bank account that's maintained with your church's employer's identification number, you'd want to include those. The one group you won't see listed on here, and it's just because how it's done and how it's documented in the Book of Discipline, is United Women of Faith, I think is their new name. It used to be United Methodist Women, but United Women of Faith. They would not be included in the church audit just because of how their funds are kept separate, but they should also do an audit of their records too. For some reason, they are included in the church audit, but the United Methodist Women are, because their funds and their units are considered separate, that they would have to have a separate audit, but United Methodist Men would be included in the regular overall church audit. Okay. So we'll kind of move on to budgets then. And budgets, they really are a management tool. You're looking at those, finance is looking at those, you're trying to decide and determine like how much revenue do we think we can bring in the upcoming year based on what we've seen in previous years, and how are we going to spend it? So it can also show the financial direction of your church and express who you are. So if you're a church that's really involved in youth ministry, you can see that through your budget. If you've got a real robust music ministry, that can also be displayed. So this really just is a tool to help you guide your church and use that money and steward it the best you can. There are multiple people who should be involved in the budget process. You're going to look to staff because they're going to be the ones, that are going to know how that money is being spent and what they need to do for the upcoming year. Your stewardship team, if you have one and are doing that stewardship campaign, you're going to want to reach out to them and how the results of that campaign have come through. Your finance team, your trustees, ministry teams, and your SPRC. Those are all important people because they're all going to have information about different aspects of the church that you want to include as you're building this budget. So some of you may ask, well, where do we start? Well, you want to just kind of look at your vision of your church's ministry. Where do we want our church to go? What do we want our church to be known for? What do we want to do for the community? So you're going to look at that. If you do pledge cards, you're going to want to look at the pledge cards and, total those up, see what people have pledged for the upcoming year. And if you don't do pledge cards, you can always look at what you've received in the current or previous year. I think I saw a hand. I'm getting ready to go up.
Back to what you mentioned before, the women of faith group, are they part of this church, part of that, or are they different outside of that? Because it looks like the men's group was mentioned in one of them.
Yeah, the United Women of Faith groups, they are not included in that overall church audit just because of how they're separate, and I'm probably not explaining this very well, but they are just separate for some reason, and so they would have to do their own audit of their own records. But the United Methodist Men, if your church has a group, would be included in the overall church audit.
If there is a group of women operating at your church as a circle, does that make them a part of the United Women of Faith automatically?
I don't think so, no. I think there's certain things they have to go through to be considered one of those identified and defined groups of United Methodist Women.
We have a group that was United Methodist Women. And of course with COVID and everything, it kind of fell by the way. But we still have the finances allocated that they have. And we do not have a Women of Faith group. So how do we, in auditing, how do we consider that?
To me, she asked about, both of these questions were, we have women who meet together that are not part of the United Women of Faith.
And have a bank account.
And have a bank account. I'm going to look at Kevin a little bit on this one. It seems to me that a church council could say that needs to be part of our church audit, right? And as long as the church council makes that statement, because that it needs to be audited. I think we can all agree with that.
It is a local church organized group that's needed.
Right, so it would need to be audited just like everyone else in the church. Why United Methodist Women, now United Women in Faith are separate? There's something that happened in the paperwork, and I think off the record, I would say the women were smarter than the men, and they like that.
None of us were in that.
None of us were there. But yes, every organization, every youth account, every Sunday school account, all of those things need to be amenable to an audit, to just a check, you know? Mount Tabor is sitting here, and that was the first church that I served where it was just part of their DNA, and it wasn't people in the committee, they just got together, they had lunch, and they did a great job. Just suck it up, edit the books, they did it, and it was just a check and balance, just like you would do with your own.
Usually the men's and women's group, and I'm thinking about that are United Methodist Men United, they are organizations within the church that have their own fundraisers and make their own contributions, and they use it to supplement the needs of the church. And they have their own bank accounts too, but they are there to supplement the church's budget, above and beyond what the budget.
Those groups absolutely supplement and are essential to some of the work the church does, but I bet everyone would agree, we still should audit them.
Yes, everybody should be audited. And when I'm saying why the United Methodist women were separate, that was something that's in the book of discipline. So that's why I separated them out. But yes, every organization, every fund that you have at the church should be audited and looked at to make sure it's all being handled appropriately.
Because it is, even though they're independent of the budget, they are still under the name of the church. And so anything they do is a reflection upon the church.
Yes. Yes, everybody should be audited.
Just a curious question. You know, audits are somewhat of a burden on small churches. Has there ever been any thought given to having a centralized audit function within the conference to allow a person to come to this church, that church, spend a week doing an audit or whatever? Just a thought.
I will take that thought. I know it's not something that we have looked at thoroughly. I think it's kind of been in passing. That's maybe been mentioned, but
It's easy to say have an audit.
But I'm also going to help her out. But audit doesn't mean a CPA.
yes, it can be members of your finance committee
One church does it for another church.
or that.
I love that.
Yes, one church could do it for another church. You can help each other out. Just as long as it's not the person who is responsible for the day-to-day finances of the church, that somebody, that person can audit your books. Did you have a question back here? Or did we answer it? Okay. All right.
Here's one thing to help with the United Women of Faith and the Methodist men. It's like it is in my house. What's mine is ours, and what hers is hers.
That is true. He said one way to help out with the United Methodist women, he's like, as an example, he's like, in my house, what is mine is ours, what is hers is hers. So that is one way to look at it. So back to the budget. So yeah, things to consider is looking at your income that you've brought in years past, looking at pledge cards if you do those, and then just kind of taking into account, what pledge cards weren't fulfilled last year, so you can have an idea of maybe what won't be fulfilled this year, and also kind of thinking, well, that you could always have people move and leave your church and, go out of state and have to join another one. So you just have to take all those components in on your income to look at how we're going to kind of build that number on our income side. Items to consider on the expense side, obviously pastor salary and benefits. You need to take that into consideration. Your utilities and any building maintenance, any mortgages if you have them on the church, building and workers' comp insurance. Everybody needs to have that. And if your only employee is your pastor, you still need to have workers' comp insurance. So those are things you need to look at and consider. And then conference and district apportionments. You want to include those in your budget. Program expenses. What kind of outreach are we going to do? Children's ministry, mission trips. So looking at those, and any other organizations that you might donate to. So any of the Wesley Foundations or the Methodist Children's Home. So look at all those things that you might want to consider in your budget. Other items, a maintenance reserve fund. We all know that there are certain items with respect to maintenance, like HVAC and roofs, are very expensive. And so you might want to build in your annual budget an amount that you kind of put into a reserve fund for the time when those things need to be replaced, so that you're not having to come up with all of that money at once. You've kind of been building that reserve over a few years. And I know there are things that happen on HVACs that they break unexpectedly, but just taking those things into consideration as you're building your budget. And even considering, establishing an emergency fund and looking at that to see if that's something that you can put some money away in and build up a little bit of that too. Okay, so next we'll move on to Our Mission Covenant, which I know there have been many terms throughout the years that have described those. Some people use benevolences, some say apportionment dollars. They're all meaning the same thing. And so we ask that all churches remit 10% of their operating income for conference apportionments. That is what the 2024 percentage is, and the 2025 percentage is also 10%. And so we ask each of our local churches to participate in that every year. And I know there are also district apportionments that are then paid to the districts also. This form may be a little hard to read, but this is the form that if you do it by paper, this is the form that we ask each church to complete to remit their apportionment dollars through. And we usually send those paper forms out at the end of the year to the local church treasurers. And these forms are also on our website, so if you need to get a PDF or an Excel version of them, they are on our website. And in the past, I think we've had this available now for 2 years, you can pay your apportionments online. So some examples of so what we ask churches to do is take their operating income, and then there are some things that they can deduct from that number in order to come to a kind of a net number to calculate your 10% on. And some of those things, so capital expenditures. If you do have to replace your HVAC and it's coming out of your general operating fund, you can deduct the cost of that replacement on the form and then take 10% of the net of that number. However, if you're paying for those capital improvements out of a capital building fund, you would not deduct that expense from this. So those are just some things to keep in mind. And then any special offerings that you receive for things like United Methodist Children's Home or UMCOR, any of the special Sundays, like the Human Relations Day, World Service Day, or World Communion Day, those types of things you can deduct from there. But funds, things you can't deduct, would be funds designated by donor for regular operating expenses. So if they're just designating something for something that you would regularly spend money on anyways, it's part of your budget, that does not get deducted from that operating number at the top. Nor does any routine maintenance. So if you're just painting, replacing light bulb, thank you. If you're doing any of that kind of routine maintenance, that you cannot deduct those. It's those bigger capital type improvements that you have to do that you could deduct from that. And as I mentioned, we do have the ability to pay conference apportionments online. Unfortunately, districts you still have to write a check for. We're not set up to do the district apportionments online, but you can do conference apportionments online, and you can pay the pension and health benefits online. And so it is at no cost to you. And if you want to do that, I think it's a pretty easy system to use. I've been told and you're shaking your head, so you must use it. I think it is a pretty easy system to use, and so if you ever have any questions on it, you can reach out to me and I'll be able to help you through that. And also you'd be able to see monthly giving statements on this portal, and we send out quarterly statements by mail, but if you ever wanted to be able to see it on a more regular basis, you could see it on monthly statements through the online portal. So we'll move on to clergy payroll, an important topic and sometimes a confusing one. So clergy tax status. They have a dual tax status, meaning for federal income tax purposes, they are considered an employee of the church. For Social Security tax purposes, they're considered self-employed. So all clergy should receive a W-2 from their church. A W-2, not a 1099. There are multiple different ministerial statuses in the United Methodist Church, and we've listed those here, and these are all treated as clergy when it comes to payroll taxes. The only one that is not, and it's not listed, is the lay supply pastor. They are considered a lay employee, and so you would still withhold all appropriate taxes on a lay supply pastor. But if you have a pastor with any of these statuses, you treat them as clergy, and you would not withhold Social Security and Medicare. So yes, clergy can elect to have voluntary income tax withheld from their pay. So clergy can elect to have federal tax withheld or state withheld or both. But they would need to complete the appropriate forms, either the W-4 for federal or a K-4 for state, to indicate to you that they would want taxes withheld from their pay. And then if they do want it withheld, then you, the church, are responsible for remitting those taxes to the government. If they choose not to have anything withheld, then the clergy are responsible for remitting quarterly tax payments on their own. And there also may be local taxes, depending on what city and county you live in, and those local taxes are withheld from clergy payroll, and then have to be remitted. So that can depend on your locality. There are certain tax forms that the church then has to do if they are withholding taxes and they have more than just their pastor. They would have to do the Form 941 on a quarterly basis and report that information, and then at the end of the year, all W-2s would have to reconcile with all those 941s when they're submitted, because otherwise, if stuff doesn't reconcile, you will get a notice, and nobody likes to receive those. So that's just something you want to kind of keep in mind as you're doing those every quarter, that come year end, you're going to want to make sure that whatever is reported on your W-2s matches what's been reported quarterly on those 941s. And I did, in information that was passed out, there is like a whole packet on clergy taxes, so hopefully that'll be helpful to you. So this is just a little way we can help in calculating income for W-2 reporting. So you always want to start with their gross salary. That's the starting point. And then the things that can be reduced from that are if there are any group health insurance premiums that are withheld from their pay, any pre-tax pension contributions. So you can take both of those things out, and then that would equal their federal and state income that you would report on the W-2. And so we're going to walk through an example of that next. So the facts are, we've got somebody with a $40,000 salary. The housing allowance is $16,000. Their family portion of health insurance that they're responsible for paying through their payroll is $5,000. They have dental insurance at $500 and vision at $250, and then UMPIP, which is their pension plan that they've chosen to make a contribution to, at $3,000. So we'd start at that gross salary of 40, and then we're able to take out those health, dental, and vision premiums, and that's that $5,570. And then they can take out the pre-tax pension contributions of $3,000. And so when you get down to it, that's $31,250, which is what would show up in their box 1 on the W-2 as federal wages. And then I think it's box 16 is the state wages. So that's the number that would be reported as their taxable income. And then the housing allowance piece, because we did talk about that was part of our example, that is just for informational purposes on their W-2. So that goes in box 14 as just information only on the W-2. So the housing allowance, it is the biggest opportunity for clergy tax savings because it is not part of that box 1 taxable wages. They may exclude the allowance from gross income to the extent they use it to pay for housing expenses. And so the allowance the church must officially designate what that housing allowance is before paying it. So I think that's also part of like charge conference forms that's on there, and the clergy compensation form, it's also on there. And those can be ways of documenting what that housing allowance is. And they can only exclude it for income tax purposes, not for self-employment income tax, not for self-employment tax purposes. There are multiple different housing expenses that that this housing allowance can be used for. There's just a list of them: the rent, mortgage, insurance, property taxes, utilities. There's a whole list of them there. And then the reason it's important that the church designate a housing allowance is because the clergy then can only exclude from their federal income tax the lesser of the amount designated as housing allowance, the actual amount of housing expenses, or the fair rental value of the property. And so it's very important that the church designate a housing allowance, because otherwise, if the church doesn't designate anything, it's zero, and then their housing expenses are more than zero, but it's the lesser of that they can exclude. Yes?
In the case where the parsonage is provided and does not have payments to be made on it, should that be listed as what the general rental would be if it would be written out? Because there is no housing allowance when you're giving them a place to live.
Yes, sometimes they could also still do a parsonage allowance. So if say the church doesn't pay the utilities on that parsonage and the pastor is responsible for it, they can still designate a parsonage allowance, which would help reduce their taxable income. And also, I mean, it could be that maybe they needed to buy new furniture, which I think is something that can be excluded. So there can still be a parsonage allowance. It's not going to be near as much as a housing allowance, but there could still be something that expense-wise that they could exclude on that. But we'll walk through an example. So say the housing allowance is $12,000. Their actual expenses are only $10,000, and the fair rental value is $14,000. The amount that the clergy could exclude is only $10,000 because it is the lesser of those 3 items. And so, so even though the church designated 12, they only spent 10, so they can only exclude 10,000 of that from their income. So that additional 2,000 that was paid as a housing allowance now has to be considered taxable to them. So that is, I mean, that is on them to figure that out. They have to know that. But it is something that they need to take into consideration as they're setting that housing allowance number. On designating that, it can change mid-year if circumstances change. So say the pastor bought a new home, or they had major repairs or new furnishings. You can change the designated housing allowance mid-year, but you have to change it before it's paid out. So say mid-year they buy a new house and things are more expensive for them, so they could redesignate part of their salary as housing now. It's just it has to be done before it's paid out to them. Best practice is, kind of set that during your budgeting process. And you could also even consider like a standing rule that a certain percentage of their salary is housing, so that it's just kind of always then set for that purpose. Okay, that was a lot of information. So if anybody has any other questions, we can definitely go through those. And like I said, we passed out multiple different pieces of information and resources. So hopefully you got those, and hopefully that will be helpful. Yes?
When a pastor lives in the church's parsonage, what are the circumstances related to living there as opposed to the housing allowance?
Well, if a pastor is living in the parsonage, that is the benefit that the church is giving in lieu of a housing allowance. So a lot of times if a church doesn't have a parsonage, that's when they're then paying a cash housing allowance, because they are not then providing a place for the pastor to live. Did that answer your question?
So as a pastor living in the parsonage, she doesn't have to make that consideration when she does her taxes, that she lives there. I don't have to I do live in a parsonage. So when I'm doing my taxes at the end of the year, should I take into consideration the market value of that parsonage or not? Is that something like income? Someone has told me that it's something like income.
It might be on the self-employment side of things. I have not prepared a clergy tax return, I don't think ever in my life. So I'm not exactly sure how that figures in on the self-employment side, but it might. But yeah, I would definitely ask your tax preparer on that if you have one.
So as a supply pastor, church is supposed to pay taxes on this, I heard?
Yes, if you are a lay supply pastor, then yes, all taxes, federal, state, Social Security, Medicare, local, all of it should be withheld from your pay. Because you'd be treated just like another lay employee.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.